Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me for today's webinar, The New Normal for Your Desktop, Creating Tomorrow's Integrated Desktop Ecosystem, where I'm delighted to be joined by Logic CTO Colin Eberhardt. But before I hand you over to Colin, let me just take you through some housekeeping points. So if you'd like to ask a question, just pop it into the question box and we'll take as many as we can at the end. If you'd like a copy of today's slides, you can find these in the handout section. You might also be interested to hear that Colin has written a white paper called Building an Integrated Desktop Application Ecosystem for Finance, a guide to the tools, products, and migration challenges. So if you'd like a copy of that, just let us know in your survey response. Now, we're going to do something a little bit different with our webinar today, as we'll be supporting a charity that's very close to our hearts, and that charity is the Altitude Foundation. The Altitude Foundation was set up by Logic just over a year ago with the aim of helping disadvantaged kids who have a passion for technology to smash barriers in order to achieve a successful career. Because of COVID-19, it's never been more important to support the amazing work that these guys do. Charities have been hit hard by the crisis, and the children that this charity was set up to help have been disproportionately affected by the economic effects and the school closures. That's why we've decided to give £5 for every completed 60-second survey at the end of the webinar. So I hope that you'll join us and support this wonderful cause, and we'll be able to see at the end just how much we've managed to raise at the end of the webinar. So let me introduce you to your speaker for today's webinar. Colin Eberhardt is the Technology Director at Logic, and he divides his time between leading the research and development team and providing advisory consultancy to clients. Widely recognised as a thought leader, Colin has a reputation throughout development circles as an expert in mobile technologies. He's also directed the team that developed a securities lending system for one of the world's most instantly recognisable banks. A published author, blogger, and tech visionary, Colin still finds time to practice his considerable skills as a 7-ball juggler. Well, I never. So without further ado, over to you, Colin.
Thanks for that interesting and slightly embarrassing introduction, Claire. Yeah, that one needs updating a little bit. Anyway, I'm going to be talking to you today about the new normal for your desktop. So this is about desktop applications and what the future looks like for those. I guess if you walk the floor of any financial services institution, you'll immediately understand the day-to-day complexity that people are faced with in their day-to-day lives. I know this is your sort of typical view of a trader at work with a huge number of monitors, and they're probably at the most extreme end of complexity. But if you walk past those in operations, risk, or in IT, you will see people engaged with a large number of different applications from various different vendors, third-party systems, some of them bespoke. Basically, in their day-to-day lives, they touch on a huge number of different systems. The problem is a number of these systems are not integrated. They might be from a third-party supplier, some of them might be bespoke, and as part of their day-to-day tasks, they find themselves mapping from one system to another. I find myself doing this on a day-to-day basis. You know, maybe cutting and pasting from one application to another. Maybe I'm working on one application and I'm using something else as a point of reference. And as you do this over and over again, these mappings become effectively muscle memory. You don't even realize you're doing them, and you move to what feels like quite a productive workflow. The problem is, these sort of muscle memory based mappings, whilst they seem efficient, are actually quite brittle. If something changes, and it can be quite nuanced, if something's just slightly different, everything falls apart. And worryingly, the point at which it falls apart can be quite a lot later than the actual change that occurred. So these are quite brittle mappings. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the internal systems have fairly meager development budgets. So whilst we all acknowledge this as an issue, it's not one that's easy to tackle. We don't invest that much in our internal systems. I guess as a summary, these are complex jobs. You're not going to change the inherent complexity of the jobs that people do within financial services. But a key point is the tools shouldn't add to the complexity. So what does a better world look like? I mean, what should we be aiming for here? Now, if we look at it from a user perspective, ideally apps should be task-oriented and efficient. This is what we try in our day-to-day lives. We are executing tasks. We're not meandering around aimlessly. They should rapidly surface the data we require. They should also remove repetition. Repetition is something that can clearly be automated. Another very important point is that data should be contextualized. And what I mean by that is often we are seeking information from ancillary or additional systems because we don't have the context we require in the system that we're currently working on. We might look up some data elsewhere, whether it's a reference data lookup system or even whether it's on the internet. So ideally, data should be contextualized. It should have all the information we need to reach a decision within the same system. In order to achieve this, ideally, we'd have apps that speak the same language, that can communicate between each other, and as a result, support bespoke workflows. One thing I'm going to point out, Claire mentioned that, yes, in a past life, and I still do, I'm a bit of a juggling fanatic. And this screenshot here is from a juggling troupe called the Gandini Juggling Project. They're a London-based troupe, and this is from a show called Smashed, where they juggle apples, of all things. The reason I put this here is that I think it's a great illustration of how through tight choreography they can take something which is inherently very complex and by speaking the same language, all of these performers are highly practiced. They know who's going to move, when they're going to move, when these objects are in the air, and because they all speak the same language, it turns into a very tightly choreographed piece. It's fantastic. It's a great illustration of how through interaction complex tasks can become quite simple. So what does it mean from the business perspective? What's the ideal look like? Ideally, from a business perspective, we want tools that are easy to deploy for both internal users and external users. Also, we want to be able to integrate third-party products into our internal workflow. And the reason being is if a third-party product can deliver value at the right price, then yeah, we should accommodate that. We also want to remove the need to build our own integrations. And working in software consultancy, we do spend a lot of time integrating systems together, and there's an inherent cost associated with that. Also, really, we wish to be in a situation where legacy technology is no longer a challenge. And I know that's a big ask, but specifically on the desktop, the applications that we use on our Windows or our Mac PCs, more often than not in financial services institution, we're relying on somewhat dated technology. And one thing I want to clarify here is that there isn't a strict definition of legacy. To me, legacy is any system that's hard to maintain. It's costly. It becomes an obstacle to business agility. And then finally, an obvious thing is we want a low total cost of ownership for our desktop applications. So really, if I were to sum it up, the ideal would be a future that's ultimately free from the constraints of legacy, where old and new live side by side. And I guess this is very much an acknowledgement of the fact that we don't have huge budgets for investing in our own internal tooling. We are going to have to make do with some elements of legacy and selectively replace some of the components with something new and better. Ideally, we'd be able to have a world where the two mesh together. Now, thankfully, this vision isn't far off. If we look on the consumer side of services, most applications these days tend to be web-based or use web technologies. If you're developing a new product or service, your first port of call will be to deliver it through a browser. If for whatever reason it needs desktop integrations or certain capabilities that are not readily available within the browser, typically, again, you'll be using web technologies, but based on some kind of desktop wrapper. At the moment, we use Microsoft Teams within Scott Logic. That client is entirely written using web technologies. If you use Spotify on your desktop or Slack or WhatsApp, these all use web technologies. It's pretty much the de facto standard for building user interfaces, whether they're on the web or the desktop. So why aren't we using that throughout within financial services? And I guess the reason is really quite simple. More often than not, the reason that applications get left behind is simply the cost of migration. If you've got something which has hundreds of screens for data entry or information lookup, the cost of migration for that application can be a significant limiting factor. So let's start to have a look at some of the building blocks of a desktop ecosystem. And one of the things I want to point out from the offset is, fortunately, this isn't an all or nothing option. As I mentioned, the cost of migration can be a limiting factor. It can be entirely prohibitive. However, through some of the building blocks that are available to you at the moment, you can perform a selective migration. So to give you a better understanding of how that can happen in practice, I'm going to talk through some of the building blocks of a sort of future desktop ecosystem. And in order to illustrate that, I'll take you through, at a very high level, the steps involved in migrating a single application. So let's say, for example, we have a .NET application. So that's the application, sort of roughly speaking, in the center. And most of the clients I work with have applications that look like this. I'm taking .NET as an example. It could equally well be a Java-based application or something else. However, they typically have the same sort of architecture. They're typically quite a fat client using .NET or Java, and more often than not, they talk directly to a database, or they might talk directly to some other services within the bank. Now, in order to move this to using web technologies, the core of that application is going to have to change. You're going to have to rewrite some of that logic using web technologies. Now, in order to make that a desktop application, you're going to have to replace the browser with some other sort of runtime. So you need something which has browser-like capabilities, a JavaScript runtime, the ability to render to the DOM, the ability to render HTML, but you want to do that outside of the browser. And that's where the concept of a desktop container comes in. A desktop container is effectively a dedicated browser for your application. And again, going back to Spotify, Teams, and so on, they are basically an application which is bundled alongside its own dedicated browser. So there's one significant change there. Another pretty significant change is, whilst fatter .NET Java applications tend to communicate directly with databases and other services, with web applications, there's a technology barrier in the way. Your web applications can't easily or immediately talk directly to a SQL database. So more often than not, you will be placing an API layer in between the services that your .NET application was going to originally access. And there's certainly additional value. There's additional value to making this change. By putting API layers in between, it means that you can have a layer of abstraction. It gives you the ability to change the database schema or change the database technology behind the scenes. Also, it means that the services that are encapsulated within that database and API layer can be served to other applications. You might be able to build a mobile application, or even open up that API directly to a client, for example. So there are significant benefits to making this architectural change in the first place. Although, as you can imagine, as I mentioned, this can be quite a costly move, taking your .NET application and rewriting it using web technologies. So there are other opportunities and other things that you can do to ease migration. And I think probably the most important change that you can make is, rather than doing a like-for-like migration, you can think about whether you split your application into multiple smaller pieces. This is really quite similar to breaking up a server-side monolith. More often than not, when people take a server-side monolith and split it into microservices, it gives them the opportunity to rethink the functionality of their application. Quite a common approach is to identify what is hopefully 20% of functionality which is applicable to 80% of your users. That 80-20 rule quite often applies, and it's the same with desktop applications. You might find that there's a small subset of functionality which is of the highest value, so you pull that out first, and that is where you start making your investment. But also, one thing I quite like is Amazon's sort of 6 R's for moving to the cloud. Their first R is retire. The most cost-effective way to migrate something is to eliminate it altogether, and it's exactly the same with desktop applications. Hopefully there are components or features of the application that you can retire as you start to evolve and change it, rethink and redesign. And there are also technologies here that can ease this migration. One of the most important ones is probably the desktop message bus. So this is some of the functionality that some of the vendors in this space provide. So what this means is if you pull out a piece of your application, it can still communicate with the old application, or you can create a suite of dedicated and focused applications that all communicate together. Another useful thing is visual integration. So if you pull something apart into separate applications, sometimes you'll want to reassemble them again. You might want to reassemble them into a workspace which is dedicated to your personal workflows. So again, visual integration is another sort of feature of third-party software that allows a better integration in this new world. So that's a fairly simple, well, I say simple, that's a migration of a single application, moving from a .NET application to web-based and potentially taking the opportunity to split it into multiple components. When you're looking to migrate a whole suite of applications, it gets a little bit more complicated. There's a greater variability there. I think it's very important to, again, focus on the most high-value applications or the ones with the most high-value functionality and migrate them first. But there are also more tools and techniques that allow you to leverage this legacy technology and mix it with the new. Now, this slide's got all sorts of bits and pieces going on. I'm not going to dig into too much detail on any one of them, but I put this in the umbrella term of accommodating legacy. A very useful feature is, for example, legacy adapters. Now, in a couple of slides back, I showed you how if you take an application and split it into separate applications, they can communicate using a desktop message bus. They can communicate actions. They can communicate data. Your legacy applications written in .NET or Java can also communicate across a desktop message bus. Another interesting way that you can mix the old and new is through web views. So for example, you can embed web content within a .NET application or a Java application. And we've built a number of applications that use this technique. The one caveat I'd say there is that I think in order to make this cost effective, you probably do have to make a few user interface sacrifices. Whilst it is technically possible to create a web application which almost exactly mimics an equivalent .NET or Java application, it takes a long time to get a pixel perfect replica, and even more so, it takes greater investment to fully mimic the sort of interaction behaviors. I've worked on applications where we've spent a lot of time getting all of the things like drag and drop, even things like tab order working. That's a big investment. I think it's better to make a few sacrifices and use that as a stopgap solution. Other things, you may have heard of FDC3. This is an industry standard for communication across the desktop message bus. So what this means is rather than defining your own language for communicating between applications, you can use a pre-existing industry standard. And what this should allow is it should make it easier for your application to communicate with applications developed by third parties, whether that's a third party effectively within your own institution or a commercial third party. And again, some of the vendors in this space layer on additional value, things like app stores that make it easier to access and distribute applications within your institution. Things like unified notification centers. Windows, as of Windows 10, does have a notification center. It's not terribly feature rich. It might be suitable for your needs, but it's pretty basic. So yeah, when you're tackling the migration of a whole suite of applications, it's certainly more complicated, but there are many more options. As I mentioned previously, you should focus on your high-value applications and high-value functionality first. There are also various tools and techniques that can be used to combine legacy and new. And in terms of a long-term strategy, I think, again, borrowing from some of the techniques around microservices, a popular technique that is used to migrate from monolithic applications to microservices is one called the Strangler Pattern, which is named after the Strangler fig, which is in this image. It's basically a plant that grows around a tree using the tree's structures until it eventually kills off the tree. It basically uses the tree's structure to sort of piggyback on and build its structure around that. You can do exactly the same with microservices, pulling out functionality from a monolith. And you can do exactly the same on the desktop. You can gradually pull apart your applications until you effectively strangle them and you eventually eliminate them. So in summary, in simple terms, the desktop container is the main building block here. You do have to have some kind of tool which replaces the browser and allows you to run web-based applications on your desktop. It has to provide something that either allows an installation experience of your application, or the desktop runtime is installed on your operating system and acts as a kind of launch pad. But either way, you are replacing your legacy applications with something built on web technologies. There are various tools and techniques that can be used to combine legacy and new, and a realistic migration strategy will certainly make use of some of these techniques to allow you to do a step-by-step migration. And the goal here is not just a like-for-like migration. The main goal here should be to take your disparate collection of siloed applications and convert them into something which is a much more integrated ecosystem. So again, reflecting on the needs of the user. Don't look at this as primarily a technology migration. Focus on the needs of the user. Allow them to have contextualized data. Allow the applications to communicate with each other. Allow them to build workflows which are specific to their sort of day-to-day tasks. That should be the goal. I guess this is almost included as a bit of a side note, but it's quite important. I've been talking about, from a very high level, how you go from legacy technologies to web technologies. For me, the kind of elephant in the room here is that this is quite a technology change. The core of your applications, they might have been written in C# and WPF is one example, or it could be Java and Java Swing. Your applications in the future are going to be written in JavaScript and React, or JavaScript and Angular, or TypeScript and Vue. This is quite a change in technology. However, it's a relatively challenging change in technology. Most of these sort of slightly historic desktop technologies are what I term as very much shrink-wrapped solutions, in that if you're using C# and WPF, you've got your IDE, you've got Visual Studio, you've got a full test framework, you've got a UI automation framework, you've got a huge suite of UI components, you've got a CI/CD system pretty much out of the box. You don't need to make any choices or decisions. It's all pre-packaged for you and it works quite nicely. Within the web world, the technology landscape is a lot more fragmented. There are a huge number of different options. Do I use JavaScript or TypeScript, Parcel or Webpack, React or Angular, or do I just wait for Blazor to appear? You know, there are so many different choices that you have to make, and there's also quite a lot of churn. And I'm not going to pretend that these are easy challenges. These are quite difficult challenges to accommodate. The important thing is you do need to have a strategy that accommodates this. And I don't have time to dig into what that strategy looks like. All I'm going to say is you do need to have a strategy here. How you train your people. Do you keep up to date with the latest frameworks as they emerge? Or do you potentially create a strategy that allows you to accommodate different tools and frameworks and allow them to coexist? And I guess I'll give you a bit of a hint there. From my experience, if you're creating a long-term strategy, it has to be a strategy that accommodates change, and it has to be one that allows coexistence of old and new. Either way, this is a challenging topic, and it's something that you need to invest in. Now, in this webinar, I've talked at the conceptual level around things like desktop message bus, visual integration. I've talked about things like app stores, notification, and I've touched on some of the features that the tools and products can provide you with. I haven't dug into the details specifically and named these various products. As Claire mentioned, we're just finishing off a white paper, and that does go into a little bit more detail. As the subtitle says, a guide to the tools, products, and migration challenges. So whilst it reiterates some of what I've said in this webinar, it does provide a little bit more technical detail. So it gives you, products that you might want to look at. It gives you links to websites and various things that you might want to research further. So whilst I've kept it at a sort of relatively conceptual level here, this white paper goes into a little bit more of the detail. So I guess coming on to my conclusions and final thoughts, managing the suite of tools that's critical to running your financial services firm is a challenge. It's not easy. There are so many tools. The interesting thing is they outnumber client-facing tools easily by a factor of 10 to 1. And I should imagine the budgets are probably flipped the other way. Your client-facing tools get the money, they get the attention, they get the love. The internal tools, typically speaking, we just make do. As a result, meeting user expectation with this kind of heterogeneous collection of legacy applications on a meager budget is a difficult challenge, and we do have to be realistic here. Our internal tools are never going to have the best user experience. They're never going to be on the cutting edge of technology, but we do need to ensure that they remove the fragility and the risks around muscle memory, for example. Web technologies have become the de facto choice for application development, and there's no escaping that. So just grab a drink. Unfortunately, I'm doing a webinar on the hottest day of the year, and because it's noisy outside, I can't open the window, so you'll have to bear with me. Sorry. Yeah, see if that works. Yeah, web technologies are the de facto choice for application development. And what I mean by that is I've used the word legacy to describe a few technologies, and I want to caveat that a little bit. Technologies like WPF, Windows Forms, Java, C#, they are going to be around for a long time. Microsoft has got a fantastic track record of supporting technologies for a very long time. However, that doesn't mean to say that they are going to continue to be easy to work with. It's going to be increasingly hard to find people who are interested in those technologies, who have experience in those technologies over time. So for most of them, there's no drop dead date. It's not like Flash and Silverlight where there's a particular date that everyone knows is the final date for those technologies. They're going to hang around for a long time, but it's going to become more and more challenging to work with them. And web technologies are certainly the future. But the good news is it's not an all or nothing option. You don't have to migrate each and every application. As we've seen, you can selectively migrate individual applications or even parts of them. And as I mentioned, there are various vendor products that go far beyond just providing a desktop container. The vendor products, their main value, in my opinion, is in the tools that support the ecosystem. And those are the sorts of tools that, to my mind, it's hardly worth building them yourselves if you can find a suitable vendor product. I guess the final thing I want to say is start creating your migration strategy today. And I've deliberately put your in bold, and your migration strategy isn't going to be the same as someone else's migration strategy. It very much depends on your perspective on the tools and technologies you're using at the moment. What is legacy in your opinion? Which applications are you struggling to maintain? Which are causing issues and faults? Which are the ones where you can find a significant business benefit by redesigning and re-platforming? And also, what is your experience with web technologies? Have you got a web technology strategy? So, as I mentioned, rather than jumping in feet first and just picking a vendor product, form your strategy first. Work out how you want to evolve your desktop, and then look at the web technologies and the vendor products that fit your strategy. So that's it for my presentation. Hopefully that's been interesting to you. And at this point, I'm going to be handing back to Claire, who's going to be telling you about some of the other webinars in the series.
Thank you, Colin. Yeah, I just wanted to show you some of the other webinars that we've got coming up in this series. You can register for them and watch the recordings after the live webinars on the Scott Logic website, and that URL is on the bottom of your screen now. So the next in the series, we'll see Mark Jose, a technical principal at Scott Logic, talking about building desktop applications with OpenFin. That webinar is at the same time, 10 a.m. on the 8th of July. And we've got more webinars to be announced in the coming weeks.